We do have two public hearings this evening. The first one is to hold a public hearing, waive the first reading, and introduce an ordinance regulating exposure to secondhand smoke.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, members of the City Council. We're here tonight to propose a draft ordinance regarding regulation of exposure to secondhand smoke, hold a public hearing, obtain community input, and then get some direction from the City Council. So let me just give you a bit of background first for members of the public who I see are still filing in the room, and the City Council. So this item came to the City Council earlier this year from a resident of Shelter Creek with drifting smoke into their unit. And after hearing those residents speak about the issue, the City Council appointed a subcommittee, and that subcommittee consisted of Vice Mayor Marty Medina and Councilmember Ibarra. And their charge was to meet with residents, to work with staff, and draft a proposed ordinance. So the subcommittee and myself held several meetings with residents of most of the large condo and apartment associations, and also representatives from various industry associations, such as the Apartment Association and also from the County Department of Health. We then returned to the City Council for some discussion and direction in August, the end of the summer. And at that time, we had a proposed ordinance for you that we proposed to determine whether you wanted to have that come back for introduction. One of the things we didn't do, and I'll highlight this a little bit later, and it's something that might be a matter for your discussion, is we didn't meet with representatives of business associations or owners throughout the community. We had obviously publicly noticed all of those meetings, and there wasn't really any comment from the business community, but that's certainly something that we could do going forward, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. However, certainly possible that council members may have spoken with various members of the business community individually. So what's before you tonight is the ordinance that was presented to you at the August City Council meeting, but we have just a couple of changes in it that I want to highlight. We did go ahead and update some of the findings in the ordinance, especially with respect to using the new method of electronic nicotine delivery called vaping. So that was one thing we did, is updated that definition. And we also made some changes at the request of some of the constituents. So we had a suggestion that the definition of smoking also include non-nicotine products, and we think that's clear in the ordinance, but if it's introduced tonight, when we bring it back, we might make a small clarification there. But let me go through quickly for you and for the members of the public. What is the new ordinance? What would it do? And let's start with what smoking is. So smoking would be defined to include any lighted tobacco product, weed, plant, hookah, or marijuana. That's included, and that was at the specific request of the subcommittee and the City Council, and whether it's delivered by a cigarette or by any other means, such as the electronic devices. So that's what smoking is. So smoking would be prohibited under the ordinance in the following places. In 14 months, there's a 14-month grace period that's built in, and I'll talk about that in a minute. It would be prohibited in multi-unit residences, including attached patios and balconies. And multi-unit residences are defined as more than one dwelling unit. It would also be prohibited in multi-unit residence common areas. So what are those? Well, common areas would be like halls, stairwells, lobbies, laundry rooms, swimming pool areas, decks, those kinds of places, play areas, and so on. It would also be prohibited in 90% of hotel and motel guest rooms. Many hotels and motels already prohibit smoking in their guest rooms. This would, for some of them, may allow them to have smoking in some and designate the rest non-smoking. It would also prohibit smoking in most places of employment. Well, what is that? It includes indoor and outdoor areas of many kinds. For example, construction sites. It could be lounges, break rooms, conference and banquet rooms, whether indoor or outdoor. Health facilities, bingo and gaming facilities. I see that Mr. Salmon is here and has an interest in that. Warehouses, retail and wholesale shops, childcare facilities, in most indoor and outdoor places of employment, and also in most public places. And so what are public places? Well, generally, people don't want to be involuntarily exposed to secondhand smoke when they're standing around and they have to stand somewhere, and then somebody is smoking behind them. So smoking would be prohibited in malls, parking lots, service lines, like if you're standing at the ATM machine, farmers markets, fairs, and other sorts of city events. So that's where smoking would be prohibited under the ordinance. And all of those provisions of the ordinance would go into effect within 30 days of adoption, except for the 14-month grace period for multi-unit residences. So why a 14-month grace period? And the answer to that is because some residents of an apartment or a condo that are renting might have, let's just say today, or tomorrow, or within a month, entered into a one-year lease. So they didn't have any notice, particularly, that the city was going to adopt a smoking ordinance that was suddenly going to prevent them from smoking in their unit. So in most other cities that have adopted these ordinances, they've given a grace period of at least 1 year to allow residents of those units who might wish to smoke in their units to make alternative arrangements and not be in a position where they have to break their lease or discontinue doing something in their unit that they thought they could do. So that was the reason for 14 months, a year plus a couple of months grace period. But the rest of it, unless you say otherwise, would go into effect 30 days after adoption. That's something you can consider modifying if you like. Where would smoking be allowed? It would be allowed in single-family homes. It would be allowed in rooms for rent in single-family homes and in detached in-law units. So those are all places where the presumption is that people are consenting to be exposed to secondhand smoke in those locations, and therefore it's not prohibited. It would also be allowed in designated outdoor smoking areas that are 20 feet from operable doors or windows. That's actually very important, and what we found in our experience to be one of the main drivers of compliance with the ordinance, especially for multi-unit residences. If those residents can create an outdoor designated smoking area that's comfortable, accessible, and usable by the residents for smoking, what we found and other cities have found, that the residents will use it, and they don't feel compelled to have to smoke in their units, and therefore they comply with the ordinance. Smoking would also be allowed on streets, sidewalks, other outdoor areas if they're 20 feet from operable doors and windows. That's actually a state law standard that we've imported into this ordinance. Other places where smoking is prohibited, or if the person is actively moving to another destination. So what that last part means is you can't stand out in front of residents or a business establishment and have a bunch of people smoking cigarettes there. They need to be, they can go out, they can light up, and they can go to their car, and that's not going to be a problem. That wouldn't be a violation under the ordinance. So I've talked about the grace period, but how would we outreach and educate the public about the ordinance more than we've already done going forward? And there's a couple of things that we've outlined in the staff report. The first thing we'd recommend is to prepare like a trifold little brochure that easily explains the ordinance, have that be available at city facilities, have it available for distribution to all of the associations, both business and otherwise, community organizations and so on, so that well in advance everybody knows, these are the rules are going to be changing, pay attention to these things, and then for the residents in 14 months, you won't be able to smoke in your unit anymore. We're going to encourage homeowners associations to meet with our staff well before the 14-month grace period expires to establish those designated outdoor smoking areas. Frankly, people can start using them sooner rather than later. There's no reason why they couldn't. We are going to develop, or we'd recommend developing an announcement for display on the city's cable channel. We would want to post information about the ordinance and any available resources also on the city's website. So that's how we would do outreach and education. One question that's often asked about smoking ordinance is, well, how are you going to enforce it? What are you going to do? And I think we need to be candid with the city council and candid with the public about what we can and what we can't do, but also be clear about what our expectations are. So the smoking ordinance enforcement must really be strictly complaint driven. And what that means is that the staff does not have the resources to receive a call that somebody is smoking on San Mateo Avenue and to go out and respond to that call. That's not something that the code enforcement staff has in their ability to do. The police department isn't going to be able to receive an after-hours call and say, somebody is smoking in the unit next door, can you go knock on the door at 3 a.m. and find out whether the person is smoking or not? So those are not things that the city is going to be prepared to do. Instead, what the city is going to try to do is use its education and outreach effort up front to try to get people to change their behavior before and as the ordinance goes into effect. The first line of enforcement is thankfully going to be the county. They have volunteered, as they have for many other cities, to address those complaints from residents of multi-unit housing and try to work with them. Obviously, we can't catch people in the act of smoking. That's a very difficult thing to do. The staff isn't going to drop everything to go find smokers that are out in the community that might be violating the ordinance. So instead, we're going to spend some staff time interacting with the staff and residents of those multi-unit residences and businesses to try to make them understand and get them to comply when the ordinance goes into effect. We do expect that in 14 months' time, when the multi-unit part of it would go into effect, that there will be some staff time devoted to code enforcement. There's no question about that. Staff is going to get calls. Those calls are going to need to be responded to, and we'll have to be available to do that. And it may take some time away from other community code enforcement priorities, but that is something that we have to understand and that we have to take into consideration. We are unlikely to be using police resources to enforce the ordinance, except to hand out information if they happen to be at the scene, warning notices. That was very effective in other cities where the police were given some of the trifold pamphlets. If somebody was smoking that they saw, they would hand them this and say, do you understand, sir, that this against the law, you can't smoke here, and so could you please move on or discontinue that. So that's what the city plans for enforcement. As I mentioned, there are a couple of minor edits in the ordinance. I did get a call this afternoon from Rovi Lynn Antonio of the California Apartment Association. She was very helpful. I don't think she could be here at the meeting today, but she requested some clarification about the signage having to do with where the signage, the non-smoking signs need to go, and that's not a problem. We'll provide that for you if the ordinance is adopted next time. So that concludes my staff report for the moment. I'd be happy to answer any questions, and if not, you can open the public hearing and take any comment from the members of the public.
All right, thank you, Mark. Any questions for Mark at this time? All right, this time we'll open the public hearing. Would anyone in the public audience like to address the council on this issue? Okay, if we close the public hearing, going to be precluded from talking to us about this before we take action.
Move to close public hearing.
Second.
Motion second to close the public hearing. All in favor?
Aye.
Any
And
discussion?
Mr. Mayor, before
Yes.
you proceed, I would like to note that this is really quite a really impressive indication that smoking ordinances like this have become really standard throughout the community and throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. When this first occurred in the early 2000s in other cities, there were rooms filled with hundreds of people making comments one way or the other about such ordinances, and I think that it indicates that all of the cities on the peninsula, including San Bruno, have come quite a long way in developing these ordinances and making them workable for everyone.
Great, thank you. I'd like the record to show, too, that just before the meeting, I received a letter in support of this ordinance from Breathe, California. I just want the people to know that. So, any discussion by the council or action by the council?
Through the chair.
Ken?
I'd just like to mention as part of the subcommittee and the cooperation from Shelter Creek and the residents and the staff there. I am a former smoker, smoked for, 35 years. I quit, I'm coming up on 10-year anniversary. But I do recall in 1995 when the laws changed and you had to be 20 feet away from an entrance of a public building. And coupled with that, I had a child that had a medical condition, and so I was never comfortable smoking indoors, unless I went to Vegas. So, but I think, just like you mentioned, the city attorney mentioned, the environment has changed. The communities have changed. The mindset has changed. There's a lot less smokers. And I think there's, as a former smoker that went through uh, the way we were looked at and scrutinized as smokers, we cooperated, and as long as we provided them acknowledging that there are going to be smokers, and as long as there's that cooperation and providing them a place to smoke, the people that live in these multi-unit buildings, people just feel that as long as we don't smoke indoors, we can just go right outside on our patios. Well, we learned a lot as far as, where smoke drifts and, how it affects certain people that have respiratory issues and things. So I think that's probably where we're going to have to, really center our education, is that it's not just enough to go outside. It's getting away from those public areas where smoke can actually infiltrate the residences. So I think this is a good ordinance. I think your experience in this has been valuable. And again, the cooperation of getting to this point, and we'll soon see how we deal with it once it takes effect. So thank you.
Great. Anyone else? Any action by the council?
I would like to make a motion to waive the first reading. Is that on the docket?
Second.
Motion and second to waive the first reading. All in favor?
Aye. And I'd like to introduce the ordinance.
Councilmember Ibera.
Aye.
Councilmember O'Connell.
Aye.
Councilmember Rico Medina.
Aye.
Vice Mayor Marty Medina.
Aye.
Mayor Ruane.
Aye.